I'm Mark Bragdon, librarian head of the Harriet Irving Library Research Commons, who in conjunction with the School of Graduate Studies is hosting, once again, Images of Research for the year 2026. So Images of Research basically serves two functions. The first is to introduce UNB to UNB. So graduate students are spread across many faculties and departments and don't necessarily get an opportunity outside of a relatively small circle to know what's going on across campus. So this gives people an opportunity to showcase what they're doing with pride and also to get a chance to see what other students are working on in terms of their research or professional studies. The second piece has to do with knowledge mobilization, basically taking your ideas out of the pipeline, as it were. You can think of the pipeline as the UNB world, the world of classrooms, laboratories, colloquia, specific sites where your research is happening. So taking them from that environment out into the world where they can benefit from exposure and people can benefit from exposure as well to the ideas, whether it be the general public or maybe potential funders or potential employers in the future. So we can think of, and this is my own editorializing about it, but I've given it some thought, the research experience, the graduate student experience as working in a pipeline. Pipeline's UNB, everything else is the world. And oftentimes you might think, as I do, that the world that you're living in is basically treated as this one funnel that you're passing through. And you are essentially the miniature or eventual versions of your mentors and advisors, and that anything that is outside of the purview of your specific research or professional agendas is either a necessary evil, like maybe organizing a conference, or just a distraction. So for example, participating or running your own podcast. But I would argue, and presumably the School of Graduate Studies would argue as well, because they're putting up the prize money, that if you allow your ideas to spread as they're developing, think of it as puncturing the pipeline or the sprinkler model. If your ideas get a chance to go and divert some of that energy that's pent up into the world, then it expands the reach of what you're doing. Your ideas get to nourish the world that is ultimately nourishing your ideas, let's face it. And at the same time, it's kind of like a give and take. So you're getting back the opportunity to road test your ideas in the real world and how they're impacting people, and also an opportunity to develop soft skills, kind of skills to do with collaboration, communication, dealing with people that can be useful post-graduation, whatever you wind up doing. And presumably UNB concurs as well. We've got a strategic plan here that I like to mention at every resort up until 2030, and then I'll shut up about it. And the big idea is that bold ideas can change the world, but only if the world knows about them, or more to the point, if the world cares about them. And that's what Images of Research is in part intended to do, give you an opportunity to tell the world why you care about what you do, and thus inspire a stake in your audience, in your ideas. So just to go through some terms of reference specific to the challenge. This is on the website, and this challenge will be linked from the description in this YouTube video if you don't already have a link. But basically, it's open to UNB graduate students enrolled in winter 2026 semester. One entry per person. They have to be illustrating UNB affiliated research in some way, which is to say not research affiliated with another university unless, of course, in conjunction with UNB. Entries shouldn't have been submitted in previous competitions. They have to be accompanied by a title. You have to give them a title and a brief description that is 200 words maximum that relates to the entrance work. And I'm going to get into that. AI-generated images are at this time not eligible for submission. So we're just still trying to get our heads around what that would imply. You might ask, well, what does that have to do potentially with the description? well, we're not AI policing the description, but I would tell you from my own experience, and caveat here is that I'm not one of the judges, but I know an AI description when I read it. And would it affect my judgment as a judge? It might, but I'm not a judge, so take that for what it's worth. Images can be submitted up until and including March 9th. All submitted images must be high resolution images, so not just screen captures off of the internet at whatever low resolution they come in. If you're not sure about what that means specifically for you after you come here and read these, you can always contact me. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation. Winners will be selected from a multidisciplinary jury of, well, typically faculty, but we might draw from other people as well. The criteria have to do with aesthetic appeal, creativity, and connection between images and the text and the research. There's going to be 6 winners chosen. First place gets 500, second 300, etc. Winning submissions will be displayed publicly right around the Graduate Research Conference, and you'll have to certify that this is your own work or you otherwise have the copyright permission, and etc. So I'm going to cap off here by talking a little bit about the creative aspect and the connection between your images and the text to your research. And then Nicole Boudreau is going to be talking a little bit about some aesthetic considerations for those who aren't sure about that. Okay, so last year, Dr. Sasha Mullally was referencing a book, and it was some Ideas That Stick, I think was the book. So I'm going to use a reference to a book that I've recently read called Hit Makers, which has to do with basically making your ideas or the products of your ideas stand out in a crowded field. So it mostly had to do with hit songs and that sort of thing, but I think the ideas translate very well to communicating in general. So I've drawn 3 quotes here that I'm going to tie to what you might be thinking about doing with your own research and capturing it in some way. So the first one, quality, it seems, is a necessary but insufficient attribute for success. I guess that goes back to the whole idea that bold ideas can change the world, but only if people know and care about them. So it's not enough to be doing great work. You have to be able to communicate its value in some way. And so I would invite you, when you're thinking about your submission, to ask yourself, what's the most important thing to communicate about your work? What is the essence of its value, and how are you going to communicate that through an image and through the accompanying text? Secondly, initially, in this case, my favorite books seem to immerse me in another life, but ultimately, they immerse me in me. I'm looking through the window into another person's home, but it is my face that I see in the reflection. So basically a poetic way of saying that when you find a piece of art or something that inspires you, ultimately it's taking you on a journey into yourself, and it's taking you along with the narrator to that place. So another question to ask yourself would be, which imagery captures the story of my work? Not just my work, but how I got there. How do I transport the audience into my story? Why is it that you're doing what you're doing? Why do you care about it? And why do you think others should care? And third, people have all day to talk about what makes them ordinary. It turns out that they want to share what makes them weird. And there isn't a weirder group of people. It's graduate students, as far as I'm concerned. Speaking as a weirdo myself. So you might ask yourself, how can I make the bizarre familiar, or else how can I make the familiar bizarre? So what does that mean? To give you an example from my own life here on campus, I gave a more generalized talk to do with knowledge mobilization a couple of years ago at the Canadian Institute for Cybersecurity to a packed house of mostly graduate students. And one of them asked me at the end of my talk about how she could do knowledge mobilization given the fact that her work in cybersecurity is so highly specialized and so focused in technical ways that a lay audience just could never understand. And what I said to this person was that, well, everybody wants to feel secure. They can latch onto that idea, and so that's where you have to go with it. So if you are doing something that is highly bizarre and arcane and steeped in terminology, how can you make it familiar to people by getting right to the essence or the most important thing it is that you want to communicate about it? And then conversely, if you're doing something that you think to the layperson's eyes might seem mundane and everyday, then how can you bring your story to it so that they're looking at it with fresh eyes and gazing in wonderment the same way that presumably you gaze in wonderment at what you're doing? So I'm going to go through 3 examples from previous challenges and picking on some winners here to illustrate how they are illustrating these 3 points, how these entries answer those questions. So this first one is called Organized Chaos, which is a great title. And the text is, there is beauty in what you cannot see. Great start right there. This image represents laser visualized airflow issuing from a nozzle, otherwise invisible to the human eye. Though visually complex and chaotic, its nature is revealed through a harmonious relationship of hidden underlying patterns. This image embodies a research project that uses knowledge of these patterns to develop airflow control technology. External vibrations manipulate the airflow and use feedback from speed and pressure measurements to autonomously control how far the airflow spreads. New intelligent airflow control technology is on the horizon. And this kind of makes me think of a horizon right here. And its potential use in automobiles and aircraft offers extreme economic and environmental potential through fuel savings. The inherently complex nature of the flow makes it a significant challenge. The key is to harness the underlying organization. So they've taken something that at first glance seems inherently bizarre, seems from another world, and brings it down to finding the signal in the noise or the organization in the chaos. Plus, it just looks great. Sometimes it can be easy when you've got something that's been generated through your research instruments. It is what it is. And I think in those cases, you really have to work hard with your description to do some heavy lifting there if you didn't have to do the heavy lifting with the image. This second one here, they are doing some heavy lifting with the image. There's some thought in the composition. This is out in the real world this time rather than the product of instruments. Somebody took this photo, and it's called Out of Office. Working in the remote Canadian Arctic means that experiments and sample collection look a little different than in the laboratory. This image was taken at a freshwater lake that is a 45-minute ATV ride, all-terrain vehicle ride, from the nearest town of Iqaluit, Tutiak, Nunavut. So that's in the high Arctic. Here I was measuring the length, mass, and body fat percentage of a lake trout prior to removing various tissue and otolith, which is ear bone. Samples from the fish. Lake trout are a northern salmonid that live in freshwater lakes year-round. Their close relative, the migratory Arctic char, also spends winters in the cold, ice-covered, nutrient-poor lakes of the Arctic, yet presents different behaviors. For example, while Arctic char completely cease feeding and swimming during the winter, the lake trout remains active and will attempt to feed during the winter. Our goal was to use samples we collect from both lake trout, pictured, and Arctic char from the same locations to better understand the differences in how these fish store and use their energy reserves. For example, carbohydrates, fat, and protein. And if this contributes to their differential overwintering behaviors, this information can be useful to better understand the ecological implications of competition between these species. So I would say from this first person view, it's kind of like a through somebody's eyes, and then the gripping and also accessible message conveyed in the text. You really feel like you're right there with them. You look through the window and you see yourself looking out onto the world. And then my third and final example. You look at this at first glance, not really sure what's going on. And the title, The Mud of Vimy Ridge Archived Forever. Historical archival work can be very rewarding in transporting the researcher back to the time period through the ephemera of life captured in documents other than words and images. In a report about the conditions of roads during the Battle of Vimy Ridge held at the National Archives of Canada, the mud of the ridge was captured when the document was dropped. Other documents can have burn marks, blood stains, tears from shrapnel, water staining from rain, and soot from the smoke of locomotive sheds that require frequent hand washing by the researcher. All of these help the researcher imagine what the conditions were like at that time period. Documents can be equally fragile along fold lines and prone to tearing, and 100-year-old acidic paper can literally turn to confetti when touched or turned. In historical research, context is everything, including how the documents were created and stored. And I really love this because you look at this at first glance and think, okay, not a terribly remarkable picture, but then the text transports you to the time that this mud wound up on this paper, and also gives you a sense of what it's like to be an historian discovering these things. These and all the other entries in the past 5 years, and of course the winners of those previous challenges, are all available on the same website where you will be submitting your images. So I would encourage you to go back and take a look at what's been done in the past and think about these questions that I brought up as well. To do with the most important thing you want to communicate. What is the essence of your work? What's the story behind it? And what image would capture that story? And how can you make the bizarre familiar or the familiar bizarre? So I'm going to just use a little example that basically draws on my idea of some of the entries that were less successful, but using my own entry here as an example. So my research has to do with knowledge mobilization in graduate students, and that's what I've used as a title here. I'm going to do a before and after. So imagine this was my first idea of an entry before coming to this presentation. And I've written, this photograph shows a graduate student preparing the filmmaker studio for his video shoot. And for those of you who don't know, this is actually our producer today, Rob, standing in as the model for a graduate student. My research has to do with identifying the obstacles graduate students face in multimodal scientific communication and the means for mitigating these. Factual, but kind of a snoozer. Not really something that's going to, I would argue, motivate anybody to learn more about what I'm doing. But hey, check out the after. Now there's some energy. And we changed the title. Now it's ... and action. The first time in front of the camera, a student tends to change from a regularly embodied person to one where all their energy is stuck from the neck up. The effect is less than compelling. When working with students, the first thing I do is have them practice ways to get out of their heads and into their bodies so that they feel and appear more grounded. Jumping, paradoxically, can have this effect. My research identifies the causes and proposes solutions to performance anxiety in media contexts so that students leave the institution with the necessary soft skills to thrive in an increasingly media-saturated world.
I have some things that you can consider as you're preparing your images that sort of tie into what Mark was saying about communicating what it is that you're working on, and why you care about it, and why other people should care about it. So a lot of research images, like maybe the one that Mark was showing, the before and after, the before of Rob, the producer, maybe documents the situation. But winning images communicate something. They express something. They make you feel something. So I would ask, what do you want someone to feel when they see your work? And I could ask that of the people in the room, maybe of Andrea, if she's still listening. But ideally, we want people to feel something. So first tip, you may think that you need expensive gear and big cameras and a camera crew and all kinds of things to create good images, but you don't. Light is very important. So light is, I'd argue, more important than gear. One thing, and we have not done this today in this room, but the first recommendation would be to turn off the overhead fluorescent lights if you're shooting indoors in a space like a library or a university. It is not very forgiving, especially if you're photographing human subjects. It does not make people look very good at all. Instead, you might consider window light. There are a lot of big, beautiful windows here at the library. A lot of places have windows. And it's nice to have that window light coming across the side of your subject, whether that is a human subject or instruments on a table. And I'll show some examples of why that's the case. If you're shooting outdoors, shooting at golden hour, either early, very early in the morning or in the evening when the sun is lower in the sky, always produces a nice flattering effect, especially on people, but also animals and landscapes, things like that. The light is more flattering and interesting. And you can move your camera to get different light angles and effects, but you can also move your subject. So those are some tips in regards to light, and I do have some examples. So this is an example. So first, I will ask, which of these two portraits do you think looks better? The one on the right, yes. And so the poor unfortunate soul on the left, do we know how she was lit?
Poorly.
Overhead fluorescent lights. Yes, not very flattering. You can see the hot spots. Her eyes are completely dark because it's coming directly from overhead. That is a similar effect when the sun is high in the sky. Everyone gets raccoon eyes. On the right, we have a woman who was lit by a window that was here. So you can see how it gives dimension to her face. She's very beautifully lit. So turn off the overheads. Here, similar example, which would you say is more flattering here?
The right.
Also on the right. So this woman is lit by a flash. So it could be a flash on your iPhone or any flash that's attached to the camera. When we have flash coming on the same axis as the camera, this is what happens. So it's very harsh, creates unflattering, strong shadows. So here on the right, she was lit by a flash, but it was coming again from the side or from an angle. So that's kind of what you're looking for if you're moving your subject around outdoors, like that trout that we saw earlier, or people. You kind of want that light not to be coming right directly at the subject. So the direction of the light changes the meaning. Flat light, as we call it, when it's coming directly at the subject, is more for documentation. Like, yes, you can recognize the person. There are no shadows, no dimension. It's very documentary. When we have side light, it gives sort of texture and depth to the image. It's more interesting. And then we can also have backlight when the light source is behind the subject. So you've seen sort of silhouette images and I have some examples to share, but that is often more dramatic, adds some atmosphere. So this is an example of food photography. And on the left, can you tell if this is flat, side, or back light? Can you tell where the light source is coming from here on the left?
Straight on.
Yeah. So that's flat. So you see the absence of shadows. It's just very one-dimensional. Whereas on the right, can you tell where the light is coming from? Which direction relative to the croissant? Yeah, exactly. The shadows are here. So you can see photography is a two-dimensional medium. So the direction of the light can help give it more dimension and make objects sort of pop and appear three-dimensional. So that's what's happening on the right. And we see side light here. Again, this is a macro image. I think some of the submissions are in the realm of macro photography. So here again, we've got side light coming here, and it really shows all the texture and dimension of this leaf with water droplets. And here an example of backlight. So it's, as you can see, very dramatic. We just see the shapes, the silhouettes, and if any of the participants photograph or work with animals in their research, or even humans who have a lot of hair, furry or hairy creatures often look very nice in backlight because it, as you can see, the little chick, it just creates a halo of light, which is really, really beautiful. Color is another thing that we can be intentional about with our images. So we have warm colors and cool colors. Warm colors are more energetic, they can create urgency, more intimate, and cool colors are sort of the opposite, more clinical, can be calm, distant. And sometimes we can have both of them together, which would be more complementary colors. So, blue and yellow, or red and green, the opposite on the color wheel. So that creates a lot of visual impact and contrast, which can be helpful in conveying a strong visual message. And then we have monochromatic palettes. It can be black and white, or just when we have different sort of variations on a theme, browns and beiges, or blacks and grays. And that can create clarity, but in those cases, it's more important to have stronger shapes to create that same impact. So here we have an example of contrasting colors in both. We've got the sort of orange and blue, and then the red and green. Those are cells, I think, and yeah, I forget what the other one is picturing, microscopic things that I don't understand, but a good example of those contrasting colors to create visual impact. And this is a black and white image, but we can see the use of the shapes to create that visual impact in the absence of color. Composition is another tool in your toolkit that you can use to tell the story of your research. So if you include everything in the kitchen sink in your image, if everything is important, nothing is important. So there are a few rules. Of course, we can break the rules. A few rules that we can apply to our visual storytelling to help create that impact. So the rule of thirds, you may have seen on your iPhone. I think it's off by default, but you can activate it. There's a grid. You may have wondered why it's split in three like that, but that's what we call the rule of thirds. So often it's impactful to place the focal point or the subject of your image on the intersection of these lines, which would be sort of the first third of the image in this case. So it just creates a stronger image. Also the use of negative space. So here we have an image of, it looks like a breakwater and the end of a dock, but we have the whole right side of the frame that's empty. And it just creates I don't know, you feel like you can breathe, just a sense of space. So that's something that can be useful to draw attention to your subject. Also, leading lines. So this is an interesting angle, a portrait shot from below, sort of up at this man. And we can see, can you see the lines that are leading into the subject? They're illustrated here, but all the lines are pointing straight at the subject. So that's another tool you can use. And you can do that often outdoors with, if you're photographing a road or rows of trees with the horizon, sort of the vanishing point can create those lines. Framing. Always look for a frame within a frame. So obviously the image itself is framed, but here we have a dead tree that's framing another tree or a little bush, it looks like. And reflections, that's another one. This is an interesting shot, looking up at the sky through a reflection in a puddle. So looking for reflections is something, another tool you can use. Adding a human element can also create impact. A lot of research maybe is, some of the submissions that you were talking about earlier, Mark, or showing had, looked like maybe a slide from a microscope or just, macro photography, things that don't often have human elements. But if we can include hands or a fingernail or something to show scale, or even if you're outdoors in the field, you can include a human figure that draws attention. Like here, working in the soil, we have the hands holding the soil. And on the right, the teeniest frog that's smaller than a fingernail. So we know, because if you didn't have the finger there, if it was on a rock or something, you may not know how small it is. And here we have, maybe someone has an image of the terrain where they're doing their field work, including a human figure, even if it's an anonymous one, can bring some visual interest to that image. Same here. The lab, we have just a silhouette of a human figure, but it draws us in. And finally, I was mentioning at the outset that expensive gear is not all that important. Other things are more important in creating a strong image, and most of us have a phone in our pockets, and your phone is enough. A lot of the images that I shared today could have been, I don't know if they were, but they could have been captured with phones. The cameras are very good. So being intentional is more important than having expensive gear. So cleaning your lens, very good. And using the tap to focus rather than just letting the phone kind of decide where the focus is. You can also use the manual exposure setting on your phone. I don't know a lot about Androids, but on the iPhone, you can sort of click and drag your finger down, and that will, depending on the scene, decreasing the exposure can create a bit more drama. And I always like to enable the grid on my phone, so I've got everything ready for good composition. Stabilizing your phone if you're shooting in low light, even if you're just kind of bracing against the wall just to stabilize it, that can be helpful. And changing your angle, getting an unusual angle, like the man with the leading lines. It was clearly taken from below eye level. Sometimes we just, if we're a tall person or a short person, we just point our phone and that's the angle. But sometimes it's good to get down low or maybe get up high and just try an unusual angle. So these are examples of images that were taken with an iPhone, for example. iPhones nowadays can do pretty good macro photography. And this is a portrait, which I think looks quite nice, flattering light, taken with an iPhone. And here just some images of the little slider for the exposure. And if you click and press, it will lock the focus and exposure where you want it. So then you can recompose your image and have something a bit more precise. Oh yes, and we can also play with the depth of field. So that's the blur in the background behind this portrait subject. We can make it in sharp focus, or we can also decrease the focus for artistic effect and isolate our subject. So, in closing, some things to consider as you're preparing your images of research. Think about what you might remove in your image to make it a stronger, cleaner composition. If it's not part of the story or helping you tell your story, then maybe it shouldn't be in the image. So what aside from your focal point, what else is competing for attention? You may want to remove it. Is the light intentional? Is it just a really documentary, boring, flat front light? Or could you maybe move your subject, if it's a human subject or a trout or, or an animal, could you maybe change the angle of the light to give that subject more dimension? We talked about composition. Are you clear on what your focal point is, and will the viewer be clear on what your focal point is? There needs to be a clear subject in your image. And do you think it might evoke an emotion for the viewer of this image? Are you using colors, warm colors, cool colors? Is it monochromatic with some really interesting shapes? What might someone feel when they look at your image? And sort of to Mark's point, would it resonate with someone outside your field? Sometimes we work on very technical topics and there's a lot of jargon, but can we capture that visually in a way that it might resonate with someone who maybe doesn't understand all of the technical aspects? So I wish you well in your preparation for the Images of Research competition, and thank you so much for having me here today.